As the House knows, tonight I shall move the motion. Thank you, Last Corla. As the House knows, tonight tens of thousands of people will sleep in defective homes. Homeowners, private rental tenants and social rental tenants. We now have defective block in 13 counties across the state. We also have anything up to, according to an independent report commissioned by government, 100,000 apartments, duplexes and houses with significant fire safety, balcony and water grass defects. And the problem is, in particular, the party of the current Minister for Finance has always been exceptionally slow to respond. It took several years of campaigning by homeowners affected by pyrite in Leinster before we eventually got a pyrite scheme. It took several years and one death in Priory Hall before Fine Gael moved to redress those. And it took much longer and greater campaigning by homeowners in Donegal, Mayo Clare and elsewhere, as well as the Constructive Defects Alliance, before we finally got some movement on those areas as well. And the problem, of course, is there are still very, very significant issues with the defective block. That legislation is not fit for purpose and needs to change. We have yet no sight of a scheme for people with apartments, duplexes and homes affected by wider Celtic Tiger era defects. In fact, Darragh O'Brien's recent announcement, Darragh O'Brien's recent announcement indicates that there might be no scheme for those homeowners until the middle to the latter end of next year, with no possibility of redress funding until 2024 at the earliest. And while many people were looking to budget 2023 for greater progress, there was deep disappointment. One of the small facts that has got missed in much of the budget debate is that the government's own contribution to funding for defects has only been increased by 5 million, and no scheme, as I said, for others. And then on top of that, the government has taken an eminently sensible idea and is making an absolute mess of it. Sinn Féin has always said, and we will continue to say tonight, industry has to make a contribution to the cost of remediation. If you take the Department of Housing's estimates in terms of defective block and the independent report's estimates in terms of building defects, we could be looking at a figure of 4 to 5 billion euros for remediation alone. So industry, and particularly those most responsible, have to pay. But the problem is what government has done is they are taking a very high levy, applying it on a very, very narrow section of the construction industry and on products. And what that will result is very, very significant increases, particularly for those people who already have to pay extra to remediate their own homes in Donegal and Mayo and elsewhere. Those people who are building their own homes, 20% of all new home completions, and in particular small and medium-sized building contractors who both ministers know are already struggling with viability. An extra 10% on their core material will push them over the edge and some out of business. And the problem is it doesn't have to be like this. There are better ways to approach this levy. And we have long argued, based on our knowledge of other jurisdictions, that first of all a levy should be applied much more broadly, not on one sector and one group of products, but right across industry, from quarries to block manufacturers to construction companies. The second, it should focus on profits. And in particular, those companies and corporations with very significant and growing profits who have an ability to pay and absorb the increased costs without passing it on to the consumer. And of course, the government completely leaves out construction companies, completely ignores banks, both of which contributed to the crisis and are profiting from it, and no discussion of non-life insurance industries. So we firmly believe it is possible to construct an industry contribution, a scheme through legislation and negotiation with industry that would allow a significant amount of additional revenue on top of the 200 million which we believe government should be placing into remediation of defects annually, not the 65 million committed to by the government for next year. And in particular focusing on those who should pay, who can pay, and if the government acted appropriately would pay. There is a better way to do this, Minister, and I know you are both reasonable and intelligent. Please do not introduce a levy which will force homeowners in Donegal, Mayo and Clare to have to pay an extra 10% on top of the gap that you've already left them with tens of thousands of euros. Do not pay struggling buyers and first-time buyers footing the bill, and do not jeopardise small and medium-sized building contractors. Listen to our advice, take on board our proposals, work with us in industry, and let's have a fair system to ensure industry pays to 100% redress for all homeowners and tenants living in defective buildings across the state.
Minister, on numerous occasions I have engaged with you and the Minister for Housing around the role of the banks in contributing towards redress for the affected families in this scandal. And I recall one exchange in the National Convention Centre when the Dáil was sitting there, when you looked puzzled at the fact that banks, who are the mortgage lenders, whose assets would be reduced to zero with houses that are impacted by defective blocks, would have their assets restored to full market value with the help of the state. And the bank were not being asked to play any role in any of that. But worse than that they weren't making a financial contribution. They have not assisted families to restructure their loans or to even write down debt. And actually, the role of the banks, I can only speak with authority about my home county of Donegal, is absolutely shameful. Right up to this moment that I speak, families who need help from their banks to navigate this crisis, to rebuild their lives, haven't been helped. Yet you are not proposing a levy on the banking sector to assist with this crisis. You're not even asking them to help the families who are affected, based on a recent response I got from the Minister for Housing. That's just shocking. Shocking. If we look at the scandals from the pyrite that affected the families in North Leinster and Dublin, through to this defective block crisis, which is pyrrhotite, mica and pyrite in the west of Ireland, and growing numbers of counties. It's estimated 13, 14 counties are affected now at this stage. And of course, the tens of thousands of people in houses, apartments and duplexes who were failed by the Celtic Tiger, greed and recklessness and the defects there. Nobody has been brought to account. Nobody. Not one person. Not 1 cent has been taken from the people who delivered that misery all across this country. Nobody brought to book. The Minister said last October that he would appoint a senior counsel. That senior counsel would look at a public inquiry to learn the lessons from these scandals. I recently got a parliamentary question response. Not only has he not appointed a senior counsel, he hasn't even given the terms of reference. I talked to campaigners in Donegal in recent days. They haven't been consulted about terms of reference. Can you imagine any other country that would have such a devastating impact on so many families, with billions of euro of impact to the taxpayer who aren't affected, and nobody brought to book, nobody held to account, and not even a senior counsel or terms of reference? For God's sake, do you not understand the hurt and devastation that people have gone through all across this country in almost every county because of the greed and recklessness, because of the relationship between builders, manufacturers and those who were in government throughout all of those years? But then it gets even worse, because we're in the committee in July, and we're listening to evidence from the experts in terms of the legislation the government was bringing through. And we learn from them that right now there are quarries continuing to manufacture defective concrete blocks. For Christ's sake, even as we speak, and you talk about the billions it will cost the taxpayer and everything that has to be done, you're still allowing quarries to manufacture defective concrete blocks. No accountability, no contribution, and it still goes on today. So this debate tonight, this bad decision that you've made around the concrete levy, I've been asked to take this opportunity to please say to the government, will you demonstrate by your actions that you're having zero tolerance of this type of recklessness that has destroyed people's lives, that you're going to hold them to account, that you're going to bring them to book, that you're going to end the misery that has been delivered on people, and that you're going to give them 100% redress, no matter where they live in this state. So this is the opportunity tonight. It isn't just about this foolish concrete levy. It's about showing people that this will never happen again, that nobody will go through this again, and the taxpayer will not be exposed, but worse, that families will not have their lives destroyed. That's my plea tonight. And please, Minister, finally deal with the banks.
Margaret, not our fault. That's what tens, nay, hundreds of thousands of apartment dwellers across the country are saying. Many of them in my own constituency, as more and more of the shoddy workmanship, the blatant disregard for fire safety standards, the criminal construction of dangerous homes in the Celtic Tiger era come to light. These homeowners, occupiers and landlords are all discovering that they have to pay tens of thousands of euro to make good the failures of the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael government's light touch building regulations. These people are faced with the unenvious choice of being locked out of their home for fire safety reasons, being forced to find alternative homes while repairs are carried out, and are living in fear for years with no block insurance, all due to poor building construction and regulation. As apartment dwellers such as those in the Crescent Park West are being told to magic up 15,000 within 6 weeks out of a total of 67,000 that's required to fix an issue, a fire safety issue. There are 232 in this complex, occupied by people in their 20s, 30s and 40s and their kids. There are tens and hundreds of thousands others expected to hear the same issues. Many of those expected to hear good news at the budget, but no sight of the urgency, no sight of the 100% redress scheme for the state's scandalous failure of regulation. As one woman said when faced with a crippling 15,000 demand, she says, "These are life-changing debts to put on a person. Myself and my husband work full-time to pay our mortgage, childcare and support our 3 children. We have nothing left at the end of the month. We cannot afford the charges which are levied at us through no fault of our own." Or in the complex, the social housing complex in Bridgeford Court in Dublin 8, where the residents got a letter in June. "Please do not use the balconies until further notice, until remediation works have been carried out, as the decking may not support people." Think of that, and think of the chaos that would cause up and down the country. It is on your watch that this is happening, and it is on your watch that no scheme has been put in place to help people to ensure the redress for something that is not their fault.
I believe that the defective concrete products levy that has been proposed by the government is badly designed and will have the effect of increasing costs to homeowners. Indeed, the Society of Chartered Surveyors have said it would increase the cost of a home by over €4,000. If implemented, and I'll just bring it to development in Churchfields and Mulhuddard, 800 houses, social and affordable houses and cost rental, would increase by €3.2 million. Sinn Féin agree that we need a levy, and it would have to be the right and appropriate thing to do if it was done the right way. There are very profitable developers out there who are making tens of millions in euros profit. The banks are making record profits. They should pay up. We are also calling for the quarries and suppliers to be also held to account financially. In Dublin West, we have had hundreds of homes that were affected by pyrite. Now we have hundreds of apartments who have major fire and structural issues. One apartment block has permanent fire wardens until each apartment owner pays up tens of thousands of euro. Many people don't have that money. We in Sinn Féin believe strongly that the government should widen the remit of the existing Pyrite Resolution Board to allow it to start processing applications for building defects from early 2023. The pressure that the pyrite homeowners and the mica homeowners are experiencing, the hurt, the anger, the stress, the distress that they are feeling is shared by those in defective apartments. It was caused by greedy developers and suppliers, along with light touch regulation by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. This contributed to this massive problem that we have today. It's time to do the right thing for all those affected by pyrite, mica and defective apartments, and make the right people pay, and for you to take responsibility for your past failures. It's
extraordinary that we have a statement here tonight that these blocks are still being made, and we know that's still going on. We know that the defective buildings are probably still being built. People have given examples in their own constituency. The government announced an anemic scheme of compensations, never once tried to go after those who caused the actual problem. And once again, it's the Irish people who are asked to pick up the tab. And just like the insurance levy, the Irish people are being saddled with the bill and a levy that's due to go on indefinitely, it seems. And that's the way most people that I know are looking at this. The levy, as we know, will add possibly 4,000 to the price of a house. And that's not our calculation, that's coming from the Society of Chartered Surveyors. And for what? We're talking about 80 million a year to fund a 2.6 billion of compensation. This levy would have to be in place for more than 30 years to cover that. Again, in my own constituency, there are hundreds of desperate homeowners who are living in homes that have been affected negatively by the fire and safety defects. There are apartment owners who can't use their balconies because the struts are so rotted and were never actually treated. I've seen this, I've talked to these families. The windows are falling out. And what happens then? The builder goes into liquidation. And what's he do then? His family have opened a new company across the road and they're building houses there, and he walks away from the problem. Is that fair, Minister? I don't think it's fair in anyone's term. The government, we have to break with the belief that Irish people should always be the ones to pick up the tab for corporate and commercial bad practice. We must hold those who are responsible for defects to account, be it developers or providers. Light touch, self-regulation is what government seems to love and what have constantly led us to disaster. This levy should be put on the banks, profits of big developers, and those who are responsible for the defects. It's not the owners, it's not the people who are living them, it's the people who built them, and we're not following that up, and it's happening still to this day.
That government hopes to raise 80 million a year from this levy to part fund a scheme by placing the burden on people who had no hand, act or part in creating those defects really is deplorable, particularly when we all know that those who were responsible were there because of a lack of regulation or light touch regulation under previous governments. And now, in the midst of a housing crisis, when government continually pays lip service to their plan to make housing affordable, you expect the public to believe that the way to do that is to actually increase the price of the main ingredients, blocks and concrete. It wasn't Sinn Féin who said that this would raise the cost of houses. This was the Institute of Chartered Surveyors. €4,000 they have said it'll increase the cost of a home buy. And those seeking to buy a home, or those even seeking to extend their agricultural buildings, cannot foot a bill because this government is so focused on actually blaming the bricks and the blocks instead of those who have responsibility. And that lies with the developers, the banks, the insurers, and that's where the focus of this levy needs to be. Now, government backbenchers have been beside themselves outside of the walls of Leinster House to criticise this levy. They too see that it is fundamentally flawed. But I will bet you tonight the price of one of them blocks that they will come in here tomorrow and they will vote in favour of the government. Another exercise in misinformation of say one thing and do something else. If the parties on the opposite side of this House put 1/10 of the effort into pursuing those who are actually responsible for causing this issue, as opposed to those who they see as being financially responsible for it, we would all be in a much better place. And it's very hard for those of us who stand in this House who have never been affected by the mica, by the pyrite, by the defective apartments, to truly understand the impact that that has on people, the impact that that has on families. But I've spoken to the apartment owners in Lake Point and Mullingar. I've heard their concerns. I've seen them physically break down in tears at the very thought of having to foot a bill for which they had no cause in creating, something that was so outside of their control to actually address. It is truly truly shameful what is being asked of these people to do. They are not the professionals in this situation. The professionals have ran off into the wind. They closed the doors and reopened under another name a few days later. And it is government's responsibility to step up here. It's government's responsibility to put the financial burden, to put that levy on those who caused this in the very first place, not those who are left living with the consequences of that light touch regulation.
Ceachta Thomas Gould, 2.5 minutes.
The price of an average three-bedroom semi-detached house in Cork has risen to €350,000. That's the latest figure from a survey by Real Estate Alliance. People can't afford an extra 10% in money, because in money terms that is €3,000 to €4,000 added to the price of their new home. These are people trying to get on the property ladder to buy for the first time. And what this government is doing, the reality is that the country block levy is going on to them. This government we've told this government that your policies increase the house prices. House prices now are at an all-time high in the history of the state, and that's under a year watch. Once again, instead of tackling developers and people who have profited from these homes, you want to put the tax back on ordinary people. So, just like in the days of the bank bailout, remember the good old days where the banks were bailed out, but ordinary people were left behind? Now, the government tells us this needs to be funded, and we agree, but we disagree on the way it should be funded. And that's what we are saying today. There are other ways. Instead of putting the money on the people who can't afford, we put it on the people who have profited. That is the fundamental difference between us in Sinn Féin and this government. Big banks, developers, speculators have all profited. And the minister just stood there and he said, the duty to the taxpayer. I find that astounding when the minister announced last week in the budget a new vacancy tax which comes in at 0.3%. And today I listened to one of his government colleagues tell us about what they're doing in Vancouver and how all the vacant properties are being used up in Vancouver because they brought in a levy or a tax. The levy in Vancouver is 3%, 10 times more than what government TDs are coming here talking about what we should be doing. And if we had our way, it would be a lot more than that. There are 100,000 properties lying idle in this country. So when it comes to it, you look after the landholders, the speculators, the developers, and once again, the ordinary people suffer. And they're the facts.
Deputy Rose Conway-Walsh.
Minister, I listened to you intently there. Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin. That's all the answers that you have to anything. For people watching in on this, from Mayo, I'll talk about Mayo in particular, I think they would be absolutely disgusted. You talk about trade-offs. What they see is the trade-offs between the Galway tent, the relationship with developers, and the cronyism that was rife in this country. That's the trade-offs that they see. And it really, really makes me angry to have to hear what you have to say around this, because I have worked on this issue for over a decade now, and I have seen how it has destroyed people's lives. So to pass it off as somehow a party that hasn't been in government in all that time is absolutely ridiculous. Mayo homeowners impacted by high rate and those looking to build a house, and the farmers who are planning even to use concrete, even for a wall or a shed, look on in amazement as you try to wriggle out of the mess that you and Fianna Fáil are responsible for. At least be honest about it. For those 10 years, I've been asking for accountability and for those responsible for plunging families into the nightmare of pyrite to be held accountable. That means those who supplied the products, those who sold the homes to innocent buyers, the banks who lent recklessly and profited from forcing homeowners to continue paying mortgages for a pile of rubbish that this government left them with. Insurers who took to the hills, they gladly took the premiums and then they took to the hills. And a government who are so enthralled by the developers that they forgot and failed to regulate the industry, because that is what has happened here. And I am urging the TDs especially the TDs from Mayo, who know these people and know what they've gone through, to vote with us tonight and to vote against the government. This is just totally, totally wrong. And the twists and the turns that are trying to be done with this, that somehow it's Sinn Féin's fault that we've landed in this mess, and that this levy, who is going to put more, look at where we were last week. We were in a situation with rising inflation. We were in a situation where the construction inflation gap was widening and widening, and what do? You come along and widen it some more. It's disgraceful.
Thank you, Last Concorde. I would like to thank. Under the government's design, this 10% will be directly passed on to young couples and individuals who have saved and borrowed to build their new home, or are in the process of buying a new home or a new apartment. That's according to the Charter Surveys of Ireland and the leading think tank, the ESRI. But, more disturbingly, the people whose homes have been decimated by Pirate and Micra will see their remediation prices also increase. Some of these folks have stood outside the gates of Leinster House for over a year now. I have spoken to some of them. They are tormented, broken-hearted, and some have lost family members through suicide. This is the scale of this man-made problem. Surely these are the people the government should be looking after the most, and not penalising them through a badly designed levy. We in Sinn Féin believe a more concentrated and targeted approach should be implemented. Those who profit from their own greedy, irresponsible behaviour in providing inferior materials and concrete blocks that have devastated homes and caused untold despair to families should be made pay. That's why we want to make sure the levy is placed on a broad section of the industry, focusing on the super profits like the cuckoo funds and the large developers and the banks. The government hands are not clean in this either, with disregard to regulations and in some cases removing regulations during the so-called Celtic Tiger era, allowing quarries, block manufacturers, developers and large builders contractors to build and supply deficit materials without any checks or inspections. Finally, we know this remediation scheme is a once-off huge cost and needs a revenue streamline. But it also needs frontlining by the government, which did not happen in the budget, just a mere $5 million extra. However, that streamline must be based on fairness and specifically targeted towards the real culprits.
Deputy Johnny Girk.
Thanks, Minister. There is serious concern over this concrete blocks levy, with very genuine fears of serious increases in house prices. Those building a home will be faced with increased costs. What you're doing here is placing the cost of defective materials on the shoulders of people who are struggling to buy a home, or who had no hand, act or part in this scandal. It was under your own watch that there was light touch or no regulation. The scheme is badly designed and will mean first-time buyers will see their house prices soar. The Society of Chartered Surveyors have warned that this scheme could see €4,000 added to the price of a house, and that on top of a huge increase in building materials in the last 2 years. This is hitting ordinary people's pockets at a time when they are already struggling, with sky-high housing costs due to this government's failure to tackle the growing housing crisis across the state. It will cost jobs, as some small contractors would have contracts signed up to at least a year in advance and will not be able to absorb those extra costs. The cost of concrete had already increased by approximately 30% since February 2021. Our motion calls for the government to hold those actually responsible for housing defects to account. It calls for a defects levy that instead focuses on big developers, banks and those responsible for the defects. At the minute, the banks own most of these assets that are worth very little or nothing. We are going to hand them assets that are worth hundreds of thousands of euro each, with no cost to them. Talk about backing a horse, he loses and you get your money back. That's what's happening with the banks. On RTE drive time last week, the levy should be abolished pending further discussions. It seems to run contrary to the government's policy to make housing affordable as possible. You don't make something affordable by increasing the price of a basic ingredient. That's not Owen O'Brien talking. That's Willie O'D. For once, I would have to agree with him. Thank you.
And of course, if this was about the industry paying the price, then of course we wouldn't be here this evening. And I think it is quite frankly naive of the Minister to think that this will not be passed on to people building their first homes and to those forced to rebuild their homes. And I listened to Minister Donoghue's response to our motion earlier on, and he spent much of his response justifying why the banks and the developers couldn't possibly be asked to pay. He said that these are the people that Sinn Féin always want to go after, never mind the fact that they are actually responsible. Of course, there is no such similar concern for ordinary people. And it reminds me, and others have referenced that this evening, when Fianna Fáil wrecked the economy and the people were left to bail out the banks and will continue to for generations. The people did not cause either, but again, why would the government ever hold those actually responsible to account? I live in a rural area near a small village. There are 2 family homes at the moment being built on my road. They're the first family homes been built by young couples since I was a child. Building a home already in a rural area is massively expensive. Before you lay a block, you spend hundreds in relation to percolation, you spend thousands on a water connection, on an ESB connection, thousands in relation to the planning permission, you pay thousands in development fees and you get nothing in return. And it costs an awful lot of money today because of inflation, because of building materials, every single one of them increasing significantly. We have a housing crisis that is getting worse, and the government's proposal is to increase the cost of building a home. You could not make it up. And this proposal will punish people building their first home. It will punish people forced to rebuild their homes because everything that they put into it is now crumbling around them. It will punish people for your failure as government to actually regulate the construction sector. And rather than deal now with that lack of regulation, instead you are looking at putting the cost on the taxpayer. And this is despite the fact that the defective block issue hasn't gone away. It's still happening. We still have quarries producing defective blocks. Developers have walked away, and as some have mentioned here this evening, in some cases they're still building homes. This is embarrassing, and people will see it for what it is, and it must be removed.
Look, I have to say the twisted logic behind the decisions of this government can often be mind-boggling. But the defence of the concrete block levy that we've just heard tonight would send the head spinning. In the midst of a housing crisis that has merged with an inflationary crisis, the government is actually proposing a measure that will make houses more expensive. You've essentially proposed a defective funding mechanism to pay for an underfunded defects remediation scheme, which by your own admission, Minister, are going to cost ordinary workers, families and small businesses. This measure will mean that houses will cost more. Every expert in the field has reaffirmed that as a matter of absolute fact. In fact, government aren't disputing that. They just claim that the increase will be less than what those experts claim. This measure will mean that less houses will be built, and that's particularly the case in rural areas where many one-off building plans have already been shelved due to soaring costs, and for many more, this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. This measure will result in job losses and company closures. And the bitter irony is that it will be likely those concrete companies who have maintained high standards and who didn't and don't produce defective blocks that will be put into jeopardy as they compete with others who don't apply the same standards. And as always, this government have ignored the blight on this country that is the border. Naturally, many of those building, especially in counties like my own, will travel north to purchase material that isn't subject to this levy. And indeed, government have provided no insight as to how they will deal with imports from outside of the island altogether, both in relation to standards and this levy. And finally, I fear that this measure will make farms unsafe and perhaps even unviable. Farmers that are already under severe pressure due to increased costs and reduced cap supports will simply forego plans to build slurry holding tanks, sheds or animal housing. And I've listened over the past number of days to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backbenchers whispering that they accept that this levy is a harebrained notion. Well, they have their chance now to stop whispering and to start speaking up for their constituents by supporting the Sinn Féin motion and rejecting the government amendment.
Thank you, Chair. I listened very carefully to the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donoghue, and he said this government has a duty to homeowners living with defective homes. Now, that will come as a great surprise to those homeowners, because they have been living with defective homes for over 11 years. They have been campaigning for action from government. And how many homeowners in Donegal have received their full grant amount in those 11 years? 14. In Mayo, 0. In Clare, 0. How many apartment owners with fire safety or structural defects, or duplex owners or homeowners have received any remediation compensation from the state? The answer is 0. That's not a sign of a duty to homeowners. The Minister for Finance also said there was a duty to taxpayers, and maybe I'm wrong, but if we had tackled this back when the problem first arose, back when the construction industry had an excess of labour, materials were cheaper, and we desperately needed to stimulate the economy in 2011, 12 and 13, it wouldn't cost us a fraction of what it's going to cost us now. And therefore, both by delaying action, the last government on this has increased the emotional impact on families and the financial impact on the state. And yes, the Minister for Finance is right, Sinn Féin is committing more. In fact, the 200 million figure that I quoted is what we would have in exchequer funding year on year to tackle that. And the reason why is because we have to compensate for the fact that after 10 years of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments in one form or another, these homes have yet to be remediated. On the cost variations, the Minister for Finance is right. There are different variations. He's quoting departmental figures. We're quoting the Society of Chartered Surveyors. They do have a real-time tracking index. But if the department has an independent analysis with independent data, publish it. And I'd be more than happy to compare it with the information that we will get from the SCSI and see which is more accurate, because with the greatest respect to the Minister of State, the Finance Bill isn't going to give us that detail. It would require the department who's undertaken that study to publish it. But for me, what was most interesting about the Minister for Finance's comments is that he didn't actually respond to the 3 central criticisms that we've made of his scheme. He is right. We agree with him on the principle that industry must pay. I agree with the Minister of State. And the Minister for Finance is also right. We disagree with him on the details, because he has the details wrong. So the first thing is the government levy is too high. 10% is too high as it is designed. It is too narrowly focused on one section of industry, which means it will have a disproportionate impact on their costs. And it is a levy on products. Those 3 fundamental design flaws of what the government is proposing is a reason why the entire opposition is saying it's got wrong. And the other thing the Minister for Finance, or indeed the Minister of State, failed to acknowledge is, what have you got to say to the homeowner in Mayo or Donegal who already will have to pay 30, 40, 50, 60,000 euros of their own money to fill the gap between an inadequate remediation scheme and the full cost? And now you're saying they're going to have to pay an extra 10% for the blocks for the home. That's a fact, and you have yet to address it. Nor have you said about the impact on buyers, because whether it's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000 euros, that's money buyers can't pay. And Minister Fleming, because you know what's happening with small and medium-sized building contractors in your own constituency. I talk to those contractors right throughout the counties of Ireland. They currently cannot develop small and medium-sized building products because they can't match viability requirements. An extra 10% on their core building product will push them even further over the edge. You know that as well as I do, even if you won't admit it here. Our proposal is more sense. I never said it was risk-free. I never said it was easy. But by broadening the scope of who you apply the levy to, you're sharing the burden across a greater stretch of industry. By ensuring that you focus on profits, and particularly the profits of large corporations, you're ensuring those who are most able to pay absorb that cost. And I'll name 2. Cairn Homes. If you read their annual report published earlier this year, one of the interesting things about that report, it said that construction sector inflation for them increased by 6% last year, but that because they were so profitable, 44% increase in profits, 57 million last year, they didn't have to pass that on to the purchasers. And Cement Road Stone, one of the most profitable construction companies in the country, again, it has a level of profitability that is enormous, and they can shoulder the burden. And why do I name those 2 companies? CRH is directly linked to defects in Mayo, and Cairn Homes is indirectly linked to defects in Balmain, where families are still struggling with huge bills. And also, I do not believe this government is going to pursue those directly responsible for defects, whether quarries, block manufacturers, developers or others, to the courts. If you do, I will welcome it, but I won't hold my breath until I see it. You have got the design of this wrong. Your own backbenchers are telling you. So all we're saying is accept it, work with the rest of the opposition in the Finance Committee and put in place a mechanism to supplement the very significant state expenditure that we're going to have to see in the coming years to remediate all of these properties, with a levy that makes sense, that doesn't punish defective homeowners, that doesn't punish buyers and first-time buyers, and doesn't put small and medium-sized building contractors further over the edge. You know it's the right thing to do. Even if your line minister doesn't, you do and your colleagues do. So please, listen to what we have to say, abandon this badly designed levy and work with us to put something in place that will ensure industry pays its fair share in the right way without further hurting homeowners.
Thanks, Deputy. I now must put the question, and the question is that the amendment be made. Deputies in favour of the question say aye. Deputies against say nil. In my opinion, the question is carried. The vote will be held back to the postponed division.